Hey, what's going on everyone? It's Daggy again, back with yet another Disney Lorcana video. And in today's video, I wanted to kind of revisit a topic that I covered a few months ago, and that is how to build a Disney Lorcana deck, essentially from scratch. Now, I know that we have starter decks now, and the starter decks are a really awesome base in order to like build up decks, I suppose. They only come in certain color combinations. So just like, for example, if you wanted to build like an emerald amethyst deck, well, there's no starter deck for that. You would have to buy two different starter decks. I actually have them up on this page here. You would have to buy something like the emerald starter deck, the emerald ruby starter deck, so you get those emerald cards, and then you would also have to buy the amber amethyst starter deck so you can get all, those amethyst cards. Then you kind of, mash them together, but you're paying like twice as much money essentially, and you're gonna have amber cards left over and ruby cards left over. Ideally, if you want to have a certain color combination that is not part of a starter deck, color combination, buying singles is the way to go. Now, for today's video, not only did I want to talk about like how to build a Disney Lorcana deck essentially from scratch, I also wanted to build a budget deck. This is going to be a $20 Disney Lorcana budget deck that is hopefully better than, say, a starter deck. Now, I am going to be using Sapphire and Steel as the basis for this deck build. There is a Sapphire Steel, list here, or a starter deck. You can buy this. It's not terrible, but I do think us building one from scratch is going to be a little better. And for a few extra dollars, because the starter decks cost about like $16 or $17, and my list is going to cost about $20. So for just a few more dollars, we're going to have a more consistent list. That is something that we can upgrade over time. And I will talk about upgrades. I have like a little note. But again, this is a $20 build for a Disney Lorcana deck. And again, it's going to be like Blue Steel, which I absolutely love that name. It's from Zoolander, I think. It's one of his looks.
A lot of people have been trying to do the Blue Steel. So Ben, you created the Blue Steel.
Right. So it's absolutely perfect. We're going to be doing a Sapphire Steel ramp. I think it's a very good deck. I think it's one of those decks that's really good to play into like any other deck in the metagame. It does very well against decks that try to go wide. And what I mean by that is like decks that try to put a whole bunch of, characters on the field. That's stuff like Stitch Rockstar, where they just flood the board and try to get as much lore as quickly. Well, these blue Sapphire decks do have access to a lot of removal cards that deal just damage, which can take out those characters. I really, really like that. In addition, it's really fun because you're ramping up to your bigger characters. And by ramping, I mean you are putting extra ink into play aside from just that one per turn. So there's some turns where you might be able to put 2 ink into play, which would give you more ink than your opponent, which will allow you to play bigger characters that can quest for more lore. They have better stats. They'll stick around for a while. It's really fun. I really like it. I think it's very simple to pilot, so I think a lot of people can kind of just pick this up and do really well. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to get started. We're going to build this deck. Now, I'm going to be using Lorcania.com, which is a super fantastic website. I've been using it forever. They have like all the card images on here and a nice little deck builder. So I've already went ahead and named this one. This one's our budget Blue Steel. So over here on the side, I can actually choose which colors that I want to use. And right now it's sorted alphabetically, which is going to be totally fine. But I'm going to click on our Sapphire and our Steel, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So again, it's alphabetical order, from A to Z. So we'll just move down the list. Now again, this is a budget build. We're going to be trying to stick to commons and uncommons, but there are a couple rares that I did add to the list, and I will talk about why I added them once we get to them. There are some cards I'd really like to add. Stuff like Aurora Dreaming Guardian I think is really, really good, but she's a little bit too pricey for our budget build. So we're not going to be adding her, but we will be talking about her later. On the list here, we're just gonna, you know what? Instead of going down like this, I'm going to go by curve. We're gonna go from lowest cost to highest cost. So first up, we do want to have some one-drop characters here so we can help our board against like opponents' aggressive style deck. So if opponents are playing Lilos and Simbas and Stitches and all these other characters on their first couple turns, we want to make sure that we're kind of staying up there with them. So we're going to be adding 4 copies of Captain Hook Forceful Duelist. And let me pull up my list here. This Captain Hook is about 20 cents per card. So a whole playset, which is we're going to be adding 4 copies, is going to be less than $1. And so that's going to be really, really good. It might even get better as time goes on. At the time of this recording, it is before September 1st, before all the big box stores are getting their product. So we only have the product from like LGS's and Gen Con and, you know, all that. But otherwise, once the big box stores, you know, have their product, I'm 100% positive all the prices are going to go down. Stuff's going to be much more affordable. Regardless, this Captain Hook is really good one drop. He is inkable, so even if we get him later in the game and we don't need him, we can ink him. If we get a couple copies in our starting hand, we can ink one of them. The fact that he can challenge for 3 strength is going to be really, really good. He's going to be able to take out, you know, your opponent's Amber Simbas to Protective Cub. He'll get banished in return, but it's still a pretty solid trade. And I do really like that. He's a solid card. I do like him. We're going to be running 4 copies. And again, he's very budget friendly. Next up, we are going to be running a 1-drop, 2 strength, 2 willpower character. And basically, because of our 2 color combinations, that's either Goons or Flounder. I actually really like Goons personally, but Flounder is just fine. Flounder is also a really cheap card at only 10 cents a card, maybe even less. So for about 40 cents or, you know, 50 cents, a couple quarters, if that, we can have us a playset of Flounder. And again, Flounder is an inkable card. He can come down on our first turn. That helps put a little bit of pressure on the board. And, you know, if your opponent is playing something like Simba, the 1-drop Simba, which actually we have here, I can actually pull him up if I can find him. Future King. This Future King here, he only has like 1 strength. And 2 willpower. Flounder can take him out. And there's a couple other characters like that. He also threatens characters like Lilo and Maleficent. So not terrible, right? And if you get him later, just throw him down into your inkwell. That's ideal. Now, we're not done with our 1-drops just yet. We do want those as our starting characters, well, for our turn 1 play. So if you have either one of these in your starting hand, that's fantastic. Like, you're good to go. But we are going to be running 4 copies of the action card, Fire the Cannons. Now, this card's not inkable, but that's okay. We're actually not running a lot of non-inkable cards. This actually might be one of the only cards that's not inkable. But for only 1 ink, we can deal 2 damage to any character on the field. And ideally, you're going to want to target your opponent's characters. This is going to be really good for kind of like sniping your opponent's early game characters, maybe like their Lilos or their Maleficents that can quest for 2 lore. It's also really good for finishing off characters that maybe you don't want to challenge into. That would be characters like Cheshire Cat. Maybe you challenge it with like a Flounder, and then you can use Fire the Cannons, and now Cheshire Cat is gone, and your characters are safe because you banished him in a different way that's not through a challenge. Also good against cards like Mad Hatter, where you can use it against your opponent's Mad Hatter and kind of deny them from drawing a card. You might still have to challenge with one of your characters, but if you have 2 Fire the Cannons, you know, you can use both of them. But either way, it's really good for finishing off your opponent's characters. Really good in the early game for controlling the board. Actually not terrible later on for just getting that last little bit of damage in to finish off one of your opponent's characters. I really like it. I think it's a good card, especially in this type of deck. It's also really cheap. I have it here on my list. It's only 25 cents. Yeah, it's about a quarter. So a whole playset of this is going to be only $1. That's really good. That's pretty good. Now, let's go ahead and move on to our 2-drops, because I'm sorry, we're not done with the 1-drops. We do have one more card I do want to add, and that is Develop Your Brain. Develop Your Brain is going to be one of our 2 methods for drawing cards. Now, it does kind of replace itself, but for only 1 ink, it is inkable. You can look at the top 2 cards of your deck, choose which one of those you would like to add to your hand, and then put the other one on the bottom. This is really good in the early game. Maybe you don't get a turn 1 play, like you didn't get a Captain Hook, you didn't get a Flounder, but maybe you are looking for, you know, your turn 2 cards like Grandma Tala or Beast Mirror, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, and you don't have those in hand. You can use Develop Your Brain to kind of look at the top 2 cards of your deck and hopefully find one of those. Or maybe you're looking for something to play on your 3rd turn or your 4th turn, and you don't have anything in hand. Well, again, Develop Your Brain will help us find those cards. It's also pretty cheap as well. It's only 20 cents a card, roughly, so it's less than $1 for a whole playset. I actually really like this card when drawn later in the game, because for only 1 ink, you can kind of choose the top 2 cards of your deck, and by that point, you would probably have enough ink to play either card. So it's really, really handy. I think it's a fantastic card. Budget or not budget. So I'm glad it's really affordable. So we're going to be running 4 copies in this deck. I do believe that's all the 1-drops I do want to put in this deck. Let's go ahead and move on to our 2-drops. Now I am going to talk about first, I did mention her, it's Grandma Tala. And if we're in alphabetical order, I guess am I just not seeing her? I think, well, this is awkward. I actually don't see her. Anyway, I'm going to be finding Grandma Tala. Oddly enough, Grandma Tala is tied for one of the most expensive cards in the deck. Grandma Tala, as I double check my notes here, is about $1 per card. Yes, she's about $1 per card. That's probably going to go down in a couple days, but she is one of the more expensive cards in the deck. Here she is right here. We are going to be running 4 copies. She's an absolutely amazing card. I was really happy to see this effect in the first set of Disney Lorcana. There was a Duel Masters card that had the exact same effect, where when it was banished, it went into your mana zone. But so when Grandma Tala is banished, she goes into your Inkwell. Really, really good. She's a really good turn 2 play. You can just keep questing with her and just keep gaining lore. Your opponent either has to deal with it, or you can slowly gain some lore. Or if you need to set up like a future turn so you can have more lore to play a character, just have her challenge one of your opponent's characters and she'll definitely get banished. You'll get her for ink, and now you're going to have extra ink for your next turn. So you could start, you know, your 4th turn. So like on your 2nd turn, you put her down. On your 3rd turn, you could challenge into something, lose her. She goes into your Inkwell, so now you have 3 ink. But then you can also play something like Mickey Mouse Detective, put an extra ink into your Inkwell. Now you're up 2 ink. Then on your next turn, you can ink again. You're going to have a ton of ink, able to play those characters out. She's really good. She's good for questing, and she's good for ramp generation. And on top of all of that, she is an inkable card herself. So if you get multiples of her, you can just go ahead and throw her into the Inkwell. You know, if you get her later on, you can always just play her and just kind of quest for a lore. And if she's dealt with, you get an extra of ink, you know, so not terrible. I think she's a good card, but she is a bit more expensive at being $1 per card. So she's making up basically 1/5 of our total for our deck. So she's worth it though. She's a really good card. Now, another 2-drop card that I do want to talk about that we are adding into the deck, we are going to be running 4 copies of Prince Eric. Prince Eric is a very good challenger. Because aggro style decks, like aggressive style decks, are really, really popular, playing something like Prince Eric is going to help us control the board a bit more. We don't want our opponent to run away with the game. Very often, you'll see Amber players playing a turn 1 Lilo, followed by a turn 2 Simba that is exerted. If you are playing Prince Eric can challenge into that Simba and survive, because he has 3 willpower, and the Simba can only deal 2 damage with his 2 strength. So he is a little better than, say, Captain Hook in that regard, but if you do play a turn 1 Captain Hook, followed by a turn 2 Prince Eric, you're going to have some really good control of the board. Your opponent isn't probably going to be questing a whole lot because they don't want to lose their characters for free, because their characters aren't going to be dealing enough damage to take out your characters. And in addition, we are playing cards like Fire the Cannons, which can do a little bit of spot removal and take out other characters that maybe are hiding behind bodyguards. So I do really like Prince Eric in that regard. He is inkable, and he is a cheap card as well. I believe, yes, he is a 20-cent card. Now, I will say I'm getting all of these prices off of tcgplayer.com. You can actually like see it right up here. I was actually looking at a whole new world. I was like, is this a good upgrade? But, you know, for an average price of like $15, no, this one's not a good... I mean, if you have it, yeah, throw it in. But I'll talk about this later. But, yeah, so I'm getting all the prices here off of like TCG Player, which is pretty fair. I think that's a pretty good, you know, accurate description of prices. I know real quick that my local game store, they sell singles, and they actually base their single prices off of TCG Player. So it is widely used. But yeah, I do really like Prince Eric. He's going to be one of our other 2-drops in the deck, him and Gramotala for characters. So we're going to put him in. I will say, as an honorable mention, that if you wanted to be a little more aggressive with your lore generation, Aladdin here isn't a terrible addition as well, instead of, say, Prince Eric. I actually don't know how much this Aladdin is. I think he's Cornered Swordsman. He's only about 15 cents, right? Which is actually cheaper than Prince Eric by about a nickel. So even better. So if you do want to try to quest for more lore, you know, early on, Prince Eric isn't doing it for you, there's nothing wrong with running this Aladdin. I actually considered putting him in originally, but then I was like, oh wait, Prince Eric is actually really solid for when we're fighting against aggro decks. So I added him in there. But again, there's nothing wrong with that Aladdin. And since we're up here, I do want to talk about the other 2-drop we're adding, which is going to be 4 copies of Beast Mirror. This is going to be like our main source of draw power for the deck. Now, this Beast Mirror is about 50 cents a card. So a whole playset, which is 4 cards, is going to run us about $2. Not terrible. That's half the price of Gramotala, but still, you know, not too terrible. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it would be half the price of Gramotala. I was looking at something else. Now, Beast Mirror is going to be really good because we are going to be emptying our hand really quickly. If we are inking every turn, by about turn 6, we're going to run out of cards in our hand. Beast Mirror is going to allow us to keep the pressure going by essentially giving us an extra card per turn. Once we get to a certain ink point where we have, say, 7, 8, even like 9 ink, probably more like 9 or 10 ink, then we're able to use our Beast Mirror's effect, draw a card, and then we're going to be able to play that card that we draw because of the limitations we're going to have for our deck. Well, actually, we might need a little more because of some of the cards we're going to talk about. But ideally, that 3 ink that you use for Beast Mirror isn't really going to matter because we're going to have so much ink in play with our Gramotalas and then with our Mickey Mouse Detectives, which I'll talk about here next. So Beast Mirror is a really, really good card, really good in constructed, really good in budget, really good in limited. I think it's a fantastic common. It's only 25 cents, right? I'm sorry, it's 50 cents. Mirror is 50 cents, not 25 cents. So it's about $2 for a playset. But considering, some cards like A Whole New World's like $15, yeah, that's totally fine. So we do like that. We're adding Beast Mirror. So next up, let's move on to our 3-cost cards, and we don't really have a lot. We have 2 of them, and our main 3-cost card, and you might have guessed it, is going to be Mickey Mouse Detective. We're going to be running 4 copies. Absolutely amazing card. I guess he's uninkable as well, so we have him and Fire the Cannons. Our turn 3 play, we really do want to play this Mickey Mouse to get that extra ink into play, so we can get to like 5 and 6 ink sooner, so we can play our bigger threats as soon as possible. Just being able to generate ink for free just by being played is really, really good. His stats are okay. You're mostly just going to be questing with him as soon as he's played. He's going to be some free lore. And that's pretty good, kind of like Gramotala, but your opponent might deal with him, they might not. It is kind of like the Olaf effect where, your opponent doesn't really want to deal with them because that's like a waste of resources. Like, are they going to use a smash? Are they going to use a fire? Maybe a couple fire the cannons or dragon fire or something, right? He does his job and then he's able to quest or do a little bit of challenging. But he gets us our ramp and he is a cheap card. I'm pulling up my notes here. Mickey Mouse is a 20-cent card. So for less than $1, we can get a whole playset of him. That's going to fit our budget. We're putting him in. Now, in addition to our 3-cost slot, we're actually going to be running 4 copies of the card Smash, the action card Smash, because we really do want this removal. Grab Your Sword, unfortunately, is kind of a more pricey card. I would like to see Grab Your Sword in this deck, but that's kind of like more of an upgrade thing. But 4 copies of Smash is still going to be really, really good. It is inkable, so if you're unable to play it or you need to ink it to play other cards, that's totally fine. That's what it's there for. But on turn 3, being able to smash something can really help you out. Your opponent, if you go first, you know, you can play, I don't know, Captain Hook. Your opponent goes, their turn 1, they play a Lilo. You go turn 2, maybe you play Grandma Tala, and you can quest with your Captain Hook. Opponent on their turn 2 plays Simba Exerted, maybe, and then they draw a card. Well, on turn 3, you could smash the Simba and then directly challenge, you know, the Lilo, which would leave both of your characters healthy on the field. But in that scenario, you could also just challenge the Simba with your Captain Hook and then challenge the Lilo, but you would lose both your characters. But in this regard, Smash would be a really good trade for you because for only, you know, 3 ink, you would essentially remove 2 of your opponent's characters off the field and get a little bit of lore because your characters would be free to quest, or at least one of them. So through doing 3 damage, when combined with the 1 damage from fire to cannons, is enough to take out cards like Tinkerbell. It's enough to take out cards like Monstrous Dragon Maleficent, for example. You could take out the 5-cost Maui, although that would probably have damage from challenging, but you see what I mean? Those 2 cards, though, do hit the 5 willpower mark, and that's just really handy. It's a really solid card. I do really like it. I think it's going to do really well in this deck. So we are going to be running 4 copies to help us kind of, you know, control the board there. Those are our only cards that we're running for 3 cost. So we're going to go ahead and move on to our 4 cost cards. I think we only have 1, if I remember correctly, and that's going to be 4 copies of Maleficent Sinister Visitor. Now, this card is kind of outclassed by the Maleficent right next to her, which is the 5-cost Maleficent. But that Maleficent, she's not that much. She is $1 per card. You might be thinking, well, why do we have Grandma Tala in the deck if she's $1 per card, but we don't have this Maleficent in the deck and she's $1 per card? A big reason was initially I wanted this deck to be commons and uncommons only. So I didn't add this Maleficent. But when I was looking at prices for certain rares, I saw that they were much cheaper than I thought they were. So I thought, okay, well, maybe I should include some of these rares because it's still very, very budget. Now, I do really like the idea of a $20 budget theme, and that is still, you know, the theme of this video. All the cards I'm suggesting with this 60 card deck will roughly equal only $20. But in this specific case, you know, it is better to run the 5-cost Maleficent over the 4-cost Maleficent because you're not really going to have 4 ink on your 4th turn that often. More often than not, you're going to have 5 ink because you would have gained extra ink with either Grandma Tala or Mickey Mouse, you know, Detective. And in that regard, you'd want to play this Maleficent and then on your next turn quest for 3 lore, which is going to be really, really good. But since we're keeping with the $20 theme, I do have the 4-cost Maleficent who can quest for only 2 lore, but that's still really good. Her stats aren't terrible. She's a common card. I actually think she's really cheap. She's only 10 cents a card, right? So for like 50 cents roughly, less than 50 cents, you can have a full playset of this Maleficent, or for $4, you can have a playset of the other Maleficent. if you're able to spend those couple other dollars, yeah, go ahead and run the other Maleficent, right? But, you know, for the purpose of this video, we're running 4 copies of this Maleficent because it fits the theme, right? She's not terrible. If you are unable to ramp, you don't get your Grandma Tala, you don't have your Detective Mickey, it happens some games. Being able to play her on turn 4 isn't terrible. She has pretty solid stats. It's going to take a couple characters to take her out. 3 strength is nothing to scuff at. I mean, she would return, banish, say, a Rafiki and whatever other character challenges into her, right? I think the only other thing would be like a Smee. I think Smee has 5 strength. And then you have cards like the Wardrobe and Steamboat Mickey with their 4 willpower. They would trade, right? They would just trade and bounce off each other. But either way, she's still a budget card and we're going to throw her in there. I do think as I think about it, I think she's the only 4-drop that I have in the deck. So we're going to go ahead and move on to our 5-drop slot. And at 5, we have a couple characters, I believe. I think we have at least 2. First up, we're going to run 4 copies of Beast. And Beast is one of the more expensive cards in the deck. He is 25 cents a card. So for about $1, you can get a full playset of him. Now, I really like this Beast, especially in the sort of meta game that we have right now. And what I mean by that is one of the more popular decks is, of course, Ruby and Amethyst. And a really crucial card in that deck is Magic Mirror. And then to a lesser extent, but maybe even just equal, is Ursula's Cauldron. Being able to play Beast to take out either one of those cards, or maybe both, is going to be really, really good for you. You want to shut down that extra card draw. You want to shut down that extra deck manipulation, you know, with the Ursula's Cauldron, and just gain control of the field, essentially. Like, the more you can do to that deck, the better. Beast can also quest for 2 lore, and he has pretty solid stats with his 4 strength and 4 willpower. So he's really solid. If you're not playing against a deck that does have items, he can be used for ink, which is fantastic, but he's also not terrible to play, again, for his questing and for his stats. So we are going to be running him in here. I assume in the future as well, we're going to be seeing a lot more items. And there's still items like Beast Mirror. For example, you could be running against a steel deck that has Beast Mirror. And then we can't forget Amber has Lantern, which is another card we want to banish. So very handy. I do really like this card. And I basically run 4 copies in all of my steel decks because taking out items is very, very good. Next up, actually, I think he was the only 5-drop that I wanted to include in here. So we're going to move on to, we're going to move on to the 6-drop. And there's a couple cards I want to add here for 6-drop. First up is 4 copies of Kronk. I absolutely love this card. I still kind of play him in my constructed blue steel, like my more like competitive, like if I have like unlimited, you know, money and I can play all these other cards. I do really like Kronk. I think he's really solid. He has really good stats. He does get banished to Maui, the 5-drop Maui, but he does, you know, return banish him. But, you know, outside of that, his 6 strength and 6 willpower is really difficult to take down. Tinkerbell cannot take him down even after she's played, where she does 1 damage to everything. And then if she tries to challenge into him, it's not going to work. You're going to survive with 1 willpower and you're going to KO the Tinkerbell. So that's pretty good. I just like him. He's a really good uncommon. He is about 35 cents a card. So he's a little more expensive. He's a little over $1, about $1.40 or so, $1.50 for a full playset. But I do really like him, especially in a budget type build. He is inkable as well. So if you don't need him early on, throw him into your inkwell. But being able to play him early can really put a lot of pressure onto your opponent. If they want to take him out, they're going to be using a couple cards. They would have to use something like a Dragonfire, and at that point, if your opponent has to use like a Dragonfire, that's their entire turn, and they're not playing any other cards. So that's a pretty good win. I do like Kronk. I think he fits the theme very well. Now, also at 6 cost, we are going to be running 4 copies of Mufasa, King of the Pride Lands. This Mufasa is also an inkable card, but unlike Kronk, he can quest for 3 lore, which is really good. We want to have these high lore questers in the deck, and we want to try to ramp up to them as soon as possible so we can win as quickly as we can. He has really good stats, 4 strength, 6 willpower. He's going to stick around on the board for a while unless your opponent runs, again, a Maui into him, but that card's just incredible. So it's what are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? Also, does die to, or gets banished to Dragonfire. So, but what doesn't? I guess there's a couple cards that don't. Either way, it's a pretty good card. I really like it, especially in a budget format. He's actually really cheap. This Mufasa, I think he's a 10 cent. He's 10 cents. Yeah, he's a 10-cent card. Less than 50 cents, you can get a play set. He's not terrible, right? I like him. I think he's really fun. He's a solid card. Yeah, is this Maleficent down here better? The 5 cost? Yeah, sure, she is. But for a budget version, I love this Mufasa. Absolutely love him. We're running 4 copies of him in the deck. What are we up to here? We have 52 cards. Perfect. We have 8 slots left. I have 2 cards to add. First up, I want to talk about our 7-cost card. And in my personal opinion, I'm adding Chief Tui, Respected Leader. I do want to make an honorable mention to King Triton. You could put King Triton in here in the 7-cost slot as well. They cost about the same. Chief Tui is about 25 cents a card. So for $1, that's your full playset. I think King Triton actually was only $1. Let's actually check here. Oops, try on. Triton, the Sea King. I'm sorry, I didn't mean $1. I meant 10 cents. But he's 20 cents, so less than $1 for a playset. It's about the same, right? It's like a 5-cent difference per card. But gameplay-wise, we are talking about stat difference. Triton does have higher stats here. You can see he has like 5 strength, 9 willpower, but he only quests for 2 lore. But over here, Chief Tui does have 3 strength, 6 willpower, but he quests for 3 lore, and he has the support keyword. So it's personal preference. King Triton doesn't get banished to, say, Maui, but Chief Tui does. But Chief Tui does have a really good ability with support, and he does quest for 1 additional lore. So at this point, I would say it's whichever one you prefer. Maybe you have more copies, of one over the other. You can maybe run 2 copies of Chief Tui and 2 copies of King Triton, or 1 copy of one and 3 of the other. However you want to do it, that'd be totally fine. They're both inkable cards. They both cost 7. They're really good bombs in the sense that when you put them down, your opponent's going to be like, oh, that's a big character. Like, how am I going to deal with this? So totally up to you what you want to do. I do think Chief Tui is a little better because he does quest for 1 more lore. Kind of forces your opponent to deal with him, or you're going to get a lot of lore off of him. Our final card is actually going to be, I believe, the only rare card in the deck if you don't pick the 5-cost Maleficent. And that is actually going to be 4 copies of Maui Demigod. Now again, I initially wanted to have this as a common and uncommon deck, but I just want to show you here, if I type in Maui and we type Demigod, this Maui is about 20 cents a card. There are other cards in this deck which cost more than he does. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to break the rule for this card, and we're going to add him to the deck. He's really good for what we're trying to accomplish. He's a really good budget card. At 8 ink, that is a lot, but we are getting a lot of ink generation through Grandma Tala and also through our Mickey Mouse Detective. We also only run 2 uninkable cards, which is our Fire the Cannons and our Detective Mickey. Now, Detective Mickey also generates us an ink, so that kind of balances off, but that kind of balances out there. But with only 8 uninkable cards in the whole deck, we are going to be able to ink a card basically every turn. We're not going to have to worry about having too many uninkable cards in our hands. All we have to really focus on is getting a Beast Mirror into play, so we're able to draw the cards, from our deck, so we actually can play something, because we're going to hit a point really quick where we're not going to have any cards to play. So in a deck like this, A mulligan strategy, what I personally do is I always try to mulligan for Beast Mirror because it's so important. I need to have this, you know, on the field. I might not play it on my second turn. I have to see what my opponent's playing. If my opponent is playing Steel, then I am really hesitant to put this down. I try to maybe find a second copy. If my opponent is not playing Steel, then I just put it down whenever I feel like I can. And that's because of Beast. Most Steel decks actually still run Beast because he can just target and banish an item, and losing a Beast Mirror later in the game when you have no cards in hand and that's the only item you have in play hurts a lot. You don't want that to happen, right? So I hold on to it, but you know, I try to mulligan for it. But I mean, that's my strategy. Overall, this is the list we have, right? I do want to talk about, I did add 4 copies of every card in the deck. So we have 15 unique cards. And I did this for consistency. I think that, you know, we have a strategy we want to do here, and we want to do it basically every game. So I added 4 copies of every card. Now, when you go and do deck building, like if you see the starter decks here, for example, and this is why I have this up, you notice that the starter decks have odd numbers of cards, right? Some of these, like this Scar down here, there's only 1 copy of it, you know? Why does this Mufasa only have 2? Why does this Captain Hook have 3? Well, it does come down to play style, but I do feel like, especially in the first set of Lorcana, if you are playing a deck that doesn't have a lot of draw power, you're going to be wanting to run 3 to 4 copies of basically every card in your deck. In my opinion, ideally running 4 copies of everything would be ideal, so you're able to get your strategy off more often. Now, if you look at decks that are like Ruby and Amethyst, and you've probably seen some of those lists, a lot of those, you know, top decks, those top players are running copies of cards where like they're only singles, right? They have like 1 copy of one card, 1 copy of another card. They are able to do this in only that type of deck because of how many cards they draw with their draw power. I mean, they have Magic Mirror, the Queen, Friends on the Other Side, Maleficent. They have a lot of ways to draw cards. They can get to those single cards really, really quickly, whereas in a deck like this, we can't. I've honestly played games with decks like this where I run 4 copies of a card and I've never seen it. I've played a couple games and I'm like, oh man, I really should add this card to my deck. And then I go to edit my deck and I see that I'm running 4 copies of that card. It happens. You just don't see it sometimes. But these decks that do run a lot of draw power are able to run, you know, fewer copies of cards. So what I can say ideally is when you make a Disney Lorcana deck, you definitely, ideally, want to run 4 copies of a card. Now, there are some things you could do. For example, if I wanted to, I could run like 1 less Captain Hook Forceful Duelist, maybe run like 1 less Flounder, and then I could run like 2 Simbas, or I could run 2 Goons or something like that, in case maybe I wanted a little more options, you know, for my turn 1 play. Simba can be useful if maybe later on in the game, you know, you're looking for a certain card, and you have like a card in hand that's not helping you. You can play Simba, draw a new card, and then get rid of the card that's not really doing it for you and hopefully get something better. Simba can also be used early on in the game where maybe you don't have, you know, your turn 3 Mickey Mouse Detective, or maybe you don't have a turn 2 Grandma Toller, you know, whatever the reason. Simba can definitely help you search for those cards. Actually, how much is Simba Future King? He's 50 cents a card, right? So for about $2, you can add him to your deck. It's absolutely crazy he's that much. I think he's a really good card. He might not be for every deck, but you know, this is just an example of what you could do. You could even just take out all your Flounders and just add 4 Simbas if that's something you want to do. I like the, 1-drop 2/2s to fight against stuff like Lilos and like your opponent's Simbas and any other like 1/2 characters your opponent may play. It's just really handy. You'd also play like a Flounder, and then turn 2 you could play like Captain Hook, and then you can use Captain Hook to challenge into your opponent's Simba, and then use your Flounder to take out their Lilo, you know, just stuff like that. Oh, Flounder can also take out, say, your opponent's turn 2 Flynn Rider, who has 1 strength and 2 willpower, and he can stay on the field. So that's pretty good. That's, you know, that's something to consider. But again, that's a play style thing. I still recommend, you know, 4 copies of a card just for consistency, right? Just for consistency. 3 copies of a card you could do, right? For example, we could, if we were running more 1-drop cards, say we had like 8 of them, like 8 1-drop characters, right? If we're running Captain Hook, Simba, and we'll say, you know, Flounder, you could have 4 copies of Captain Hook, then you can have 3 copies of Flounder, and then 3 copies of Simba. That's your 10 cards right there. That's not terrible, right? Like, more often than not, you'll probably see Simba or Flounder on your turn 1. Sometimes you won't, because you just have 1 less card in your deck. Whereas Captain Hook here, because we're running 4 copies, we're going to see him, you know, most of the time. And that's what we want. Our turn 1 play, being a Captain Hook, especially if we go first, that's really good. That really puts, like, pressure on your opponent. Heck, even if you go second, your opponent can play, like, a turn 1 Sergeant Tibbs. You could play Captain Hook, and now your opponent's like, well, if I quest with Sergeant Tibbs, I'm going to lose him. So that could be something they do or something they don't do. So it's just consistency. That's what the numbers mean in these Lorcana decks. It's consistency. And if you don't have the card draw, then you're going to want more copies of cards so you can consistently see them. And so that's the goal. What's really cool is we've noticed that if a card is uninkable, so for example, A Whole New World, which is just right here. We'll talk about A Whole New World. I actually pull it up right here on TCG Player. So Whole New World is an uninkable 5-drop card. So if you have this card in your hand, you can't ink it, you're going to be able to play it. This makes for what I like to call a tech card, and that's something I picked up from, say, like Pokemon. A tech card is just something you would add like maybe 1 copy of in your deck to help fight against like your opponent's, you know, whatever, right? Maybe you add in like a 1 copy of a Zapdos, right? An electric type Pokemon, and you're running a fire deck because Zapdos has a colorless attack or whatever, and Zapdos can deal damage to your opponent's water type Pokemon for colorless energy. And that's like a tech card. You're like, okay, I have an option against water decks, which are typically super effective against my fire deck. So with these uninkable cards, it's kind of similar. You can add these into your deck to be like a sort of like a tech, like, oh, if I get it, I can play it. But if you don't get it, it's not necessarily a big deal. And on that note, I do want to talk about some replacements we could add to the deck, because some of them could be kind of like techie. One of them I do want to talk about is this Captain Hook, Thinking a Happy Thought. I think this is actually a really, really good card, especially if you are able to get your hands on, say, Grab Your Sword or A Whole New World. I think, you know, being able to play those on turn 3 is going to be really, really good. But this Captain Hook can really put in work because he can't be challenged by characters that cost 3 or less. So he can take out several characters on your opponent's side of the field without being challenged in return. He is a turn 3, when shifted, 5 strength, 5 willpower character when he is challenging. But he does have 2 strength if he is challenged. So he's not terrible. I do really, really like him. I did look up his price as well. He's about $2, right? He's about a $2 card. He is something maybe you would want to add, you know, into the deck if you want to be a bit more aggressive, or maybe you want to have like a stronger early game is maybe something you would like to do. And he is kind of like a techie card because he's also uninkable. If you have him, you kind of have to play him, but he can be shifted on top of the 1-cost Captain Hook. So there could be some games where you do need him. You know, you can get him on your 3rd turn, maybe against a really aggressive, you know, aggro deck. He can really put in some work, keep the board clear before he goes down. Really solid card. I do really like him. Other cards that, you know, I do want to talk about that could be used for an upgrade would be, say, of course, and we did talk about earlier, the 5-cost Maleficent. Again, she's about $1. So if you want to spend a little extra money, just replace the 4-cost Maleficent with this one. That'd be totally fine. If you do have the blue steel starter deck here, the Sapphire steel starter deck, it does come with 1 copy of that Maleficent. So you could throw her in there as well. Also comes with 1 copy of Maui, which is really handy. You know, so you only need 3 other copies. If you are able to spend a little bit more money, Robin Hood is obviously a really good card. Robin Hood, Unrivaled Archer, is able to challenge evasive characters, and more often than not, when he's played, he's going to be able to draw you a card. He can also quest for 2 lore. His stats are basically the same as Beast Hard-Headed, but he's just in a Sapphire version. So he's definitely something to consider. I think his price will go down a couple dollars once we see more cards hit the shelves, but I think he's a good card. I do really like him. We did talk about Captain Hook. Aurora Dreaming Guardian is also a really, really good card to add with her Protective Embrace ability, where she is able to give ward to all of your other characters. I think that's going to be really, really good. That protects them from cards like Dragonfire, you know, Fire the Cannons, single target removal cards like that. It actually would protect also against the 8-cost Elsa. Only this Aurora would be targeted by that Elsa's effect, which would leave your other characters safe from being frozen essentially for a turn. So that's something to consider. And if you do that, you could play the 2-cost Aurora, but I think the 2-cost Aurora is actually a bit more. Oh, she's only 20 cents or about a quarter. So for about $1, you can get a playset. But if you do pick up the starter set, you do get 3 copies of that Aurora, plus a single copy of the Dreaming Guardian Aurora. So you got a little bit there. I do really like these cards as a good turn 3 shift card as well, because they can sing cards, or they can sing like a whole new world or grab your sword or something. Plus 3 strength and 5 willpower is pretty good, and she quests for 2 lore. So that's something to consider for an upgrade as well. Other cards I actually really, really like. It's Han's 13th in line. So I actually really like this card. He only costs 4 ink, 3 strength, 3 willpower, quests for 2 lore, which is pretty good. And when he does quest, you can deal 1 damage to a chosen character. So that's pretty good. Really good for finishing off characters. You can always quest with him and then use like Fire the Cannons or even like Smash to take out a character. Hans, though, is a bit more expensive. He's about $4 a card, like give or take, but that is kind of going down. So not too terrible, maybe a little more than 4. I do really like him. Especially fun in probably multiplayer. We have more targets to ping, but you get to quest, which is, you know, towards your win condition. You do want to do that, but you also deal 1 damage for just questing. So really good, really handy. I think he's a good addition, something to look out for, you know, for an upgrade for this deck. Another card, of course, for removal is Let It Go, but Let It Go is about $5 a card. So for $20 or the price of our budget deck, you can get a playset of Let It Go. And I don't think there's any Let It Goes in the starter deck. No, there's in the starter list here, there's no Let It Goes. So that's up to you. I know I think I've opened 2 boxes. I think I only have 1 copy of Let It Go. I believe I might have 2. I'm pretty sure it's only 1 though. So I would have to spend a couple of dollars to get, you know, a full play set. But if you have that money, that's obviously something you got to add. It's so good. Let It Go. You got to have that hard removal. Like it's just a flat, hey, get that character off the field. Yes, you are ramping your opponent a bit. You're giving them an extra ink, maybe 2, if it's a shifted character. But it's better than having that character on the field, right? Finally, the last upgrade card that I do want to talk about that I didn't add, and I should have, is actually the 7-cost Simba, the Return King. He's actually really, really good. He is found in the starter deck as well. You do get a single copy of him. And he's actually really cheap. Oh, I guess this will work. I just typed Return King. He's only about 50 cents a card. So for about $2, you could get a full playset. I like him. If you're able to spend a couple extra dollars, I think he should be a main include in the budget list. Again, I was really trying to keep it like $20, but if I were to add Simba, I probably would add him maybe over Chief Tui. But if you want to be, I'm going to say consistent, but if you want to make sure that you're able to play your characters safely, you probably would want to play him over Maui, because Maui, while he does cost, quest for 3 lore, he does cost 8 ink, so that is 1 more ink than this Simba here. But this Simba's really good offensively. His 8 strength when challenging is able to take out cards like Maleficent, well, Monstrous Dragon, of course, not Maleficent, that's not what I was thinking, Ursula. He can take out Ursula, because Ursula, who is really popular in our Sapphire, I'm sorry, not Sapphire, in our Ruby Amethyst decks, has 8 willpower. So she's really difficult to take down without direct removal. But this Simba can. Simba Return King can actually, can I just hit back? Yeah. Can actually take out that Maleficent, or Ursula, I'm sorry, and survive with 4 willpower left, because Ursula only has 2 willpower. So really solid. I'd probably replace Maui with that Simba, but Maui is also really, really fun to play. I get it, they're both inkable cards, but if you are able to get your hands on, a couple copies of this 5-cost Maleficent, and maybe you're running either Mufasa or Chief Tui for the other 3 lore generation, yeah, go ahead and run that Simba over Maui. Now you have a good challenger who can also challenge evasive characters, which is going to be really handy, but he can also take out those bigger threats that your opponent, plays. They do have to quest first, but still he's able to take them out. So, but again, that's kind of like that's my thought process. That's how I build decks. More often than not, I do run 4 copies of cards in basically any deck I play. There are some exceptions, of course. Ruby Amethyst, with all its draw power, you can get away with running less copies of cards. And even in decks like this, you could run just a couple copies of a card or 2, or maybe you only have like a whole new world. Maybe you open it from your pack, you have 1 copy. Maybe you have 1 copy of Belle, 1 copy of Grab Your Sword, whatever. Oh, I do want to talk about Grab Your Sword. I didn't really bring it up too much, but Grab Your Sword's like $6. Oh, it's like $4. It's about $4 to $5, okay, not $6. It's about a $5 card as well. This is a really good card. You might want to play this card over, it's either Smash or Fire the Cannons. You could run all of them, but that's a lot. But if you are going to do something like Captain Hook, Thinking a Happy Thought, then yeah, having Grab Your Sword is going to be really, really good, because on turn 3, you could shift into this Captain Hook and then sing that, Grab Your Sword, and deal 2 damage to your opponent's side of the field, which could wipe them depending on what they play. Now, the one card I didn't really mention, since I'm talking about cards, is of course Tinkerbell, if I spell her correctly. Oh, it's 2 words? Oh, 2 words, which is Giant Fairy. She's really expensive. Yeah, she is really, really expensive. About a $25 card. I personally have 2 of them. I actually got really lucky and I pulled, 1 in each of my booster boxes. But, if you don't have her, don't worry about it, right? I mean, yeah, is she really good and you want to play her? Yeah, I mean, yeah, But if you're doing budget, it's not a big deal. You don't have to play her to have like a really good deck. I mean, there's so many other good cards that you can play over her that it's not backbreaking. I mean, I don't want to undersell her. She is a fantastic card, but I don't want you to feel like, oh, I can't play Sapphire and Steel because I don't have Tinkerbell. You can absolutely play Sapphire and Steel even if you don't have Tinkerbell. It's still a really fun deck. I still think it's a really high tier deck because I think it just does so well against the whole field. Yeah, it does lose to certain decks probably more often, but I think it also beats other decks more often. But I think it's one of the few decks that can hold its own against all other decks, right? It's one of those, you go into this matchup and you see your opponent is playing Sapphire and Steel, you're like, oh, okay. Like, this might be a little tough, right? You know, I might have beaten them before, but you never know. And there's also the strategy where you run a whole new world with Bell. So you ink a ton of cards, and you also play like Fishborn Quill. You get to that 10 ink as quickly as possible, and you quest with this Bell for 5 ink a turn. But if you're unaware, Bell Strange But Special is like a 40 some dollar card. So yeah, that's not happening, right? A whole new world, which I had up here, which was like, yeah, $15 or so. That's insane, right? It's a good deck, but you don't need all these cards, right? You don't need all these cards to have a fun, competitive deck. Like, I would take this into like a local tournament and feel pretty confident, right? Like, it is what it is. I think it's fun. I like these decks a lot. Another deck I do want to talk about is like Ruby and Emerald, the other starter deck here. I think that one has a lot of potential, and there's some really good cards like Tigger and Goofy, which aren't featured here, which are common cards that are evasive. Tinkerbell as well. Really good evasive cards. That's a really strong budget build as well. But I did want to give some love to Sapphire and Steel, because I have seen a lot of videos talking about Ruby and Emerald being a really good budget option, and I completely agree. I think it's a fantastic deck, budget or not budget, but I don't see a lot of love for Blue Steel, and this has been like one of my favorite decks. This actually got me to top 25 on Pixelborn. I do really like Pixelborn. I actually have a screenshot. Maybe I'll add it in here. But when I got top 25, I was like, oh my gosh. So I took a picture. But I was playing Blue Steel. I do really like it. It's one of my favorite decks. So I wanted to make a video. This is what I do when I build decks. 4 of a card is ideal. 3 of a card. If you want to see it every so often, you run 2 of a card. If it's like, nah, if I get it, I get it. If I don't, I don't. 1 of a card is either I don't have enough copies, or I have a ton of draw in my deck and I'm gonna draw it eventually, right? So that's kind of the process. If anything, my biggest tip is when you build a deck, just run 4 copies of a card and just kind of go from there. If you find out you don't need as much of it like in your deck, lower the curve, right? Or not the curve, to take out a copy or 2, maybe take it out completely. It all depends. But anyway, this is my budget build. This is how I go about building decks. My budget Blue Steel. I hope you enjoyed the video. Again, this is like a $20 deck. You can go on TCG Player, type in all these cards. Roughly speaking, it's $1. If you do it in not $1. Roughly speaking, it's $20, maybe a little more. We might be flirting with like 21. But you know, in a couple days, you know, it'll definitely be 20 bucks for sure. So, but hey, I appreciate you. Thanks for stopping by. It means a lot. Be safe out there, make good decisions, and I will see you in the next one. Okay, bye.